Days at the Morisaki Bookshop, Part 2, Chapter 4. Let's go on a trip together, just the two of us. When Momoko sprung this question on me, it was about 2 weeks after I'd seen her for the first time in years. There's a really great spot in Okutama, she said, with a glint in her eye. I nodded, feeling a bit cornered. There's a huge mountain, and on the peak is a historic shrine. The scenery is wonderful and the air is so pure. It's amazing. There's a lovely inn on the mountain where we can stay and take it easy for a bit. A girls' trip. What do you think? When I tried to imagine just the two of us going on a trip together, I started to feel a little uneasy. But she was holding my hands in hers, squeezing them tight, and I could see in her eyes that she was waiting for me to say yes. I had the overwhelming feeling that I was being pressured into it. In the 2 weeks between our reunion and this invitation, I'd been visiting the bookshop fairly often. Of course, I was there to spy on Momoko for my uncle. He and I often crossed paths as he was leaving work, but Momoko was always in the room on the second floor. Whenever I visited, Momoko was very happy to see me, and she always treated me to a home-cooked meal. When I lived there, the kitchen on the second floor had felt too small, so I never felt much like cooking there, but Momoko made all kinds of things. She simmered hijiki seaweed, beef with tofu, octopus and daikon. She fried horse mackerel nanbanzuka style, grilled pike mackerel in salt, made miso soup with daikon greens, radishes and fried tofu. I was so starved for the taste of home cooking that I basically started coming just for the food. When I called her at lunch from the office, Momoko would act like a new bride, always asking, "What do you feel like eating today?" To which I'd respond by blithely requesting whatever I was in the mood for. At first, Momoko kept saying it was her treat, so I didn't ask. But after a while, I insisted on splitting the cost and paying for half the groceries. "Okie dokie," she said, happy to oblige. "Momoko, everything you make is delicious," I said. And I meant it. I was eating my way through some of the dishes she had spread out on the little dining table as usual. "Well, you always eat with such enthusiasm. You make it look delicious," Momoko said as she proceeded to devour twice as much as what I ate. I could never figure out how she managed to fit so much food in her tiny frame. "But it really is delicious," I said, crunching on a pickled radish. "Don't you cook?" "I cook a little, but just things like pasta, never anything like this." "Well, then what'll you do when you have a boyfriend?" "You think it'll be a problem?" It's true that I didn't have much experience regaling my boyfriends with my cooking. The idea of cooking for someone made me so embarrassed that I'd avoided it up to this point. Anyway, it's not like I had much experience with relationships in the first place. Men are simple. It doesn't matter who they are. You can always seduce them with food. She laughed and said, "I'll teach you. You just try to remember." I wasn't sure I had a sense of how men felt. In fact, it seemed more like the person Momoko was winning over was me. Of course, I didn't forget my uncle's request entirely. I tried to get her to talk, but Momoko always managed to evade my questions. When I asked her something in earnest, she'd just say, "Oh, I don't know." No matter how I tried to pin her down, she'd wriggle away like an eel. She was already someone who seemed to jump from one topic to another without rhyme or reason, so she'd always end up going off on a tangent, and once the food was spread out in front of me, I would fall into a trance and completely forget to ask about anything else. That's basically how it went every time, so I didn't really make much progress. Nevertheless, I was able to learn a few things about her. When Momoko got drunk, she tended to let her guard down and tell me more, so I often urged her to keep drinking. She lost her parents early on and was raised by her aunt and uncle in Niigata. After middle school, she worked at a small factory, then left for Tokyo on her own at 21, where, among other things, she fell in love with an up-and-coming photographer. "Is that for real?" I couldn't help asking. Momoko lived for a time in Paris because her boyfriend had gone over for work, and she chased after him. She decided on her own to go without talking with her boyfriend, a bold move but very Momoko. I was young, you know. I was just a girl who didn't know anything, and he was all I thought of. Later I found out that he had a wife and kids back in Japan. That's why it ended. The idea that to have the family I'd always wanted, I'd have to destroy someone else's. It was just too much. Momoko stared off into the distance as she told me the story. She couldn't see any future in their relationship, and in the end, it all fell apart. She was broken-hearted. That's when she happened to meet my uncle Satoru. At first, she saw him as someone who needed looking after. She helped him take care of a few things, and before she knew it, they'd fallen in love. I never knew about any of that, I said, impressed by how much history they shared. My past makes Satoru jealous, so he doesn't like to talk about it much, Momoko said with a shrug. Meanwhile, Momoko sussed out the real reason for my frequent visits. It happened one night once it had become perfectly routine for us to eat together. In between sips of sake, Momoko grinned to herself and suddenly said, "Satoru asked you to do this, right, Takako?" "Huh? What do you mean?" I said, privately panicking as I attempted to keep up the charade. But it was no use. Momoko looked exceptionally happy as she reached over and pinched my cheek. I understand what he's thinking, but Takako, deep down, do I make you uncomfortable? My heart was racing as she pinched my cheek as hard as she liked. Somehow she had seen through the whole thing. It was true that there was a little part of me that didn't really love being with her. I definitely didn't dislike her, but if someone asked, I'd have been hard-pressed to say that I loved her. That's how it felt. If someone asked about her cooking, on the other hand, I would have answered right away that I loved it. To be honest, I found her a tough person to figure out. My uncle was similar in that sense. There was something I couldn't grasp about him. But she was different. It felt like no matter how many times I talked to her, I could never close the gap between us. Sometimes it felt like we were standing on opposite sides of a river, talking to one another from across an enormous divide. It's okay, because I love you, Takako, and I think it's cute how honest you are. You can't tell a lie. It makes me wish I had a beautiful soul like that. I definitely do not have a beautiful soul. I felt like she might be making fun of me, and I was a little offended, but Momoko said she really meant it. "I just lie all the time," she said, sounding lonely somehow. For a moment, she hung her head. Her facial expression revealed something in that instant that was not lost on me. I felt like it was the first time I had gotten close to what Momoko was really feeling. But it only lasted an instant. Immediately afterward, her face lit up and she became her normal self again and changed the subject, which is when she proposed her idea. "Hey, how about going on a trip together? It's too early for the fall foliage, but that means that there won't be many people and we can take our time. Are you busy at work?" She kept going on and on like this as she put pressure on me. "No, it's a relatively flexible company." "So, we're good?" Well, at first I thought I would try to say no, but for some reason the expression I'd seen on her face had left me worried. So, in the end, I agreed. "Let's do it." I can't quite explain why, but I sensed something then. It wasn't exactly a premonition, nothing as grandiose as that. It was something I couldn't put into words, but I definitely felt it when I saw her face, like it was a sign I shouldn't ignore. I saw Wada 2 more times at the Saveur before our conversation about the trip. Both times I was stopping by the coffee shop on my way home from seeing Momoko, and he was there. He'd said he came often, and it seemed to be true. He was sitting at the same seat by the window when I saw him, staring out the window as he had before. I wasn't entirely sure myself whether or not I went there because I wanted to see Wada. I don't think I went to the coffee shop expecting anything in particular, but when I walked in and I caught sight of Wada from behind, I heard myself say, "Oh." I said hello, and his shoulders trembled like I'd woken him up from a dream. He stared at me for about 5 seconds as if he were verifying something about me, then he smiled and said hello. He seemed to be asking me to join him, so I took a seat across from him and we talked. It was just small talk, nothing special, but just talking together made me feel strangely at ease. One time we even left together before the coffee shop closed and went on a little walk to the Imperial Palace. See you soon. Bye. That's how we said goodbye, even though we didn't have each other's contact info and there was no guarantee that we'd ever meet again. After that night, I went to the coffee shop a third time, but Wada wasn't there. I knew there was no reason for me to expect him to be around, but I still somehow felt let down. I felt like I'd come for no reason, but I persuaded myself that it would actually be weirder if he were there all the time. That night I took a seat at the counter and tried subtly asking the owner about Wada. He'd seen me talking to him, so of course he remembered him. He's a bit of a quiet customer. These days, as soon as it gets dark, he comes in. But I don't remember if he used to come before too. He isn't quiet, he's reserved, I said, gently correcting the owner. Oh, forgive me, he does seem like the type who tends to stay a while. Then Takano joined in from across the room to offer an absurd suggestion. Isn't he coming to see Takako? From back here they do kinda look good together. Day, and after he confesses his love to her, he and the cheerful Ukyo become a couple. But just when you think the happy days might last forever, Ukyo is forced to marry the son of a wealthy man to pay off her father's debts. With barely any prospects for his own future, Matsugoro has no way to stop the wedding. Matsugoro keeps on writing novels through his loneliness and despair. His sole motivation is the idea that if he becomes famous and makes a name for himself in the world, he might be able to get Ukyo back. Finally, when he's in his late 30s, Matsugoro's dream comes true, and he finds success as a novelist. But that's when he discovers the awful truth. Ukyo has succumbed to an epidemic and is no longer in this world. From that time on, Matsugoro spends his days drowning himself in alcohol, women, and then drugs. His dissipated life leaves his body battered, but he never lets himself forget Ukyo, not even for a moment, and he keeps going to the cafe where they first met every day. Then, one day, on his way home from the cafe, he collapses, coughing up blood. As he loses consciousness, all that remains in his heart is his memory of Ukyo. Matsugoro's painful, single-minded obsession hit home for me. After I finished the book, my heart fell silent. Tears ran down my cheeks and dropped onto the book, leaving little stains on the pages. Under the covers of my futon as I drifted off to sleep, I found myself thinking that Wada had a pretty romantic side. In my dream that night, I was the woman who ran the cafe in the novel, and I was shaking Ukyo by the shoulders, doing my best to persuade her to go out with Matsugoro. I stared at him with my mouth hanging wide open for a second, and then I furiously denied everything. That's ridiculous. Oh, come on, don't be mad. You'd better stop butting in, the owner said, running him off. Takano yelled, "Sorry," as he fled the room. As I lifted the coffee cup to my lips, I thought about what Takano had said one more time. That can't be, can it? And I told myself again that Takano had to be wrong. But what if it was true? Wada was a great guy. He was friendly and polite, and he had a good sense of humour. And he knew a lot about books, of course, too. He wasn't always boasting about himself or laughing crudely at his own jokes. With his personality, I'm sure lots of women were attracted to him. Well, what about me? Just as I was contemplating the question, I realized the owner was staring at me again. You should work on your habit of watching people so intensely, especially when it comes to girls. They'll resent you, I said coldly. The owner laughed his high-pitched laugh as he hurried after Takano and disappeared into the back of the coffee shop. I had lost my urge to think through the question, so instead I took out the book Wada had told me about, Up the Hill, and gave it a try. When I was visiting Momoko earlier, I'd come across it by chance on one of the shelves at the bookshop around closing time. When he saw the book in my hand, my uncle took it upon himself to tell me, "It's nothing special." "I don't mind," I said. I handed my uncle 100 yen and bought the book. It's a short novel, about 200 pages long. That night, first at the Saveur and then back at home before bed, I read the whole thing. It was a sad story, just as Wada had said. The story is set in Tokyo, during the period when the country was rebuilding after the war. The main character is an unsuccessful writer named Matsugoro Ida. He meets a beautiful woman who works at a modern cafe up the hill. For him, it's love at first sight. At first, she doesn't take him seriously, but Matsugoro keeps going to the cafe every